Kiersten Fishburn, and it's my great pleasure to be here tonight moderating this SAMAG event. Before we begin today's session, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. We're talking about the arts and we're talking about the environment, and it's really important when we have these type of conversations to reflect on the learnings of one of the oldest cultures in the world and one of the most exciting and new cultures that we see now with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and to also think about how land has been used, how the environment has been preserved and protected, and what we can learn from traditional custodians and owners of the land. So I join a big hello to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. And I look for guidance from the traditional owners, custodians of the land, and elders past, present and future. So thank you very much for joining us here today. The topic that we're tackling is conserving the arts and the environment, possibly one of the most challenging topics that we have currently, not just in the arts, but as a global collective. I'm Kiersten Fishburn, as I said, and I'll be your moderator today. A little bit of background about me, so you know where I'm from. I'm currently the Coordinator General of Planning Delivery in the Department of Industry, Environment and the Arts. That's a big job title, but probably more relevantly for this SAMAG conversation, I was the Chief Executive of Liverpool City Council, and before that, the Director of Casula Powerhouse Arts Centre, where we undertook many programs that dealt with environment and climate change. And I'm very proud to always see that the Arts Centre continues that tradition. And I also was the cultural manager for City of Sydney and was very proud of our program there of Sydney, Sustainable Sydney 2030, which is around green, global and connected, bringing all these pieces together. So this is how we're going to run today. We've got 5 great panelists for you, always a bit of a challenge to juggle over Zoom, but everyone's excited and willing to be involved. And we will be, I'll be giving them a series of questions so we get to know them as panelists. But what I'm looking for here is for this to be as much as possible an interactive conversation. And so if you're able to put any questions into the Q&A, I'll be able to give those to the panelists and we can get that going tonight. So we're going to look at a few things tonight. We're going to look at what the impact of the arts and cultural sector is on the environment, and also how can art most effectively speak to environmental concerns. Undeniably, climate change is both a local and a global problem. And the relationship with the environment has become the focus of many arts events and the practice of many artists, some of whom we'll hear from tonight. But what really is the impact of the arts and cultural sector on the environment? And how can art most effectively speak to our environmental concerns? How can art organisations embrace sustainability while they're shipping objects all around the world? And how can the arts community use their resources and their connectivity to lobby audiences and government for effective change? Can the arts ever actually be zero waste? What is the arts contributing in terms of the problem? I always think it's really important to go first to the artists when you're talking about anything in the arts community. So the first panelist I want to introduce you to is Rox DeLuca. Now, Rox is an artist. She's based in Bondi, working on Gadigal land, where I am here tonight as well. Her art practice converts found marine and industrial single-use plastics via jewellery-like processes in order to explore ideas of consumption, waste, and our neglect of the environment around us. She exhibits regularly in solo and group exhibitions and art prizes, including a recent solo exhibition at Articulate Project Space called, and I love this title, Still Gleaning for Plastic on the Beach. So over to Rox. Why do you work in plastics, and what led you to working this way and with these materials?
Thanks, Kiersten, and thank you for the invitation to be part of tonight's panel. I haven't always worked in plastics, but I trained as a painter and I was using upcycled materials, aluminium panels. I worked for an offset printer for a while, and I noticed the panels that he was using being discarded there, and I wanted to use them. So I've always had this interest in using what's around me. A short stay in Madrid in 2007 to 2010 led me coming back with a small child, actually, hanging out at Bondi Beach a lot. And I just started to pick plastic up. It was a really incredibly organic response to where I was at the time, and noticing a ridiculous amount of plastic shards on the beach. And subsequently, trained as a painter, I just started to make these constructions, which are very sculptural, as you can see, and it's kind of grown from there. But the light bulb moment was also going to the Sydney Aquarium around 2010, actually, and hearing Jennifer Levers, who's part of Adrift Lab, the marine scientist, hearing her talking about her work with the beautiful shearwater birds of Lord Howe Island, and hearing about her research into the ingestion of plastics. And that was horrifying, and just, I guess, made it really real for me to think about the bigger picture and to kind of make sense of the problem that continues to date. Yeah.
Rox, I have to ask a question, and this is putting my council hat back on. Do you ever get odd looks from the council officers while you're foraging for plastic on the beach?
I don't usually see the councillors down there. I did try to ask the person that was on the tractor that does rake Bondi Beach. I asked them if I could access what they found, but was told with work health and safety that I wasn't allowed to sort of access any of the plastic that they picked up. But responses from onlookers is often most annoying, actually, because I get really, good on you, love. And good on you, love. And sometimes, being offered their rubbish kind of thing. And I kind of go, you can help me. And so very patronising responses from some people, and then other people kind of might walk up and say, what are you doing? And wanting to engage a bit more. So they're the nice interactions, the nicer ones.
They're the educative interactions as well, presumably. Yeah, great. Thank you. I want to go to Jane Gavan now, who is also interested in materiality. And Dr. Jane Gavan's the Senior Lecturer in Visual Art at University of Sydney, and her research examines innovative social and environmental approaches to contemporary creative practices to discover their shared value across the community through international industry collaborations. Gavan's interested, I shouldn't say Gavan, Jane's interested in examining the sustainable use of materials and processes and the dynamic idea of invention and the history of technology. And her practice is at the nexus of material culture and material science, often using glass and nature. So Jane, part of your artistic practice is research into innovative and sustainable use of materials and processes for artists. What have you learned through this work, and how do you feel artists can embrace more sustainable practices? Oh. Do we have Jane there?
Thank you for having me, Kiersten.
Yep. That's right. Thank you.
I'm on Birrabirragal land over here in Balmain, and I wanted to pay respects to the elders, past and present. My work really started, I think, way back when I was working in a glass studio, and we call it heat, beat and treat. There were students who were firing kilns with 40 kilos of glass for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. And that was an enormous amount of material and energy, and sometimes for little benefit, depending on what they made. And I guess that was my light bulb moment to think about ways that we could do better, that I could do better in my own practice. And so I made it my mission to try and work in my practice and as a teacher to reduce the materials and energy in making work. So working through thinking about biomimicry, because nature's really smart. So using minimal energy and material is how nature operates, usually through structure. And then working with environmentally sensitive projects in communities such as manufacturing communities, because there's a lot of clean waste there. And I guess artists are looking for new opportunities for practice all the time. I'm seeing lots of changes in artist practice. They are more socially and environmentally aware than before. But what my research has really brought to the fore is that companies are more socially and environmentally aware as well, with corporate social responsibility. But these two groups haven't really been looking at each other. They've been following their own path. So I try and turn them back towards each other. And through collaboration, you can't do it alone. So I often work with museums, and museums are trusted institutions. And that's why I was really interested to speak today. They can raise critical themes. People really can engage. And that's often as a curator on these projects where I can cut through with the broader community. So I'm pretty pragmatic, and I love what I do. Yeah, my practice has really changed since I've become more environmentally and socially sensitive. Yeah.
I find it really interesting, Jane, that both you and Wax has been observing wastage, that it's been that kind of epiphany moment. In both your practices, which is really interesting.
Changed my life. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to come back to some of these themes, but picking up on the idea of what institutions and organisations can do, I'm going to introduce Guy Abrahams now, and I'm very interested in where his epiphany came from, and you'll see why in a second. So Guy is the co-founder, former chair and CEO, and client board member of Climate, and I need to spell that out for you, which is CLIMARTE, so Climate, and director of the Art and Environment Consultancy. He's been involved in a whole range of significant art areas, including chair of the City of Melbourne's Art and Heritage Collection Advisory Panel and a member of the Public Art Advisory Panel. Prior to that, though, he was a lawyer before becoming director of Kiersten Abrahams Galleries, and he's been involved in the Australian Commercial Galleries Association as well. Guy, you've clearly had a number of career paths, from lawyer to gallerist to climate change advocate through the arts. What got you into this space, and how did your past professions enable or encourage you to find your voice on climate change?
Thanks, Kiersten, and greetings from, I'm actually in Wadawurrung in Eastern Ma people country, which is down on the surf coast of Victoria, west of Melbourne at the moment. Enjoying a couple of days. Well, it was sunny, but it's pouring with rain now. So nature is forcing itself on us. It's a long story, but I'll make it short. I was always interested in the environment. At university, I was, joined the Save the Whales and protested against nuclear power. I began work in the gallery with a love of the arts, which I've been brought up with, and that developed over the 20 or so years that I was there. Love the arts, the artists, the people who are interested in art, the depth of commitment that all those parties had to their practice and their enjoyment and their engagement with art just made me really quite, optimistic about the possibilities for humans to do good and to do it with passion. During the course of my time at the gallery, we often had exhibitions which related to environmental issues. We had fundraisers, and that was an ongoing part of my personal sort of belief system and activist system, if you like. And after the 20 years at the gallery, I started to think, well, now what's the next stage of my life? And it was about the time, 2006, that Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, came out. I didn't actually see the movie when it came out. I could only bear to look at the posters. I couldn't bear to actually watch the film. And it was a couple of years later when we were having a fundraising event for the Australian Conservation Foundation that one of the gentlemen there, who was deputy chair, I think, said, listen, I run a course at University of Melbourne on environmental sustainability. You should come along and do the course. And that was actually a light bulb moment. It gave me the opportunity to make a transition, because I'm one of those people who sort of feels I need to read about stuff before I start talking about it. And that set the seeds of closing the gallery 2 years later, going back to university, doing a Masters of Environment, and really focusing on the issue of climate change. And it was during that course, I was lucky enough to be selected amongst a lot of people to do the training course with Al Gore, who does his program. And at lunchtime during that week, one of those weekends, a group of us got together from various areas in the arts. There was a musician, there was someone who reads the news, and there was a lot of pretty well-known people. And we all looked at each other and said, what's your area of the arts doing in relation to climate change? And we couldn't really come up with an answer to that. And I could say, well, I know individual artists are really interested in environmental issues, and they always have been. And, you know, as long as there's been people painting landscapes, there's been an interest in the environment. But there was no cohesive movement that I was aware of, certainly not in Australia, that was amalgamating that passion and that interest together to become a force to apply friction and pressure where it needed. And so that was really the genesis of the idea that we needed a body that would bring artists and practitioners and advocates together. And it was then subsequently a trip I made to Nevada to the Art and Environment Conference at the Nevada Museum of Art, where I was just thinking when Rox was talking, I saw a talk by an artist, Chris Jordan. He's a photographer. Many of you will be aware of him, but he took these incredible, powerful series of photographs of albatross who have died on an island midway in the Pacific. It's one of the most remote parts of land you can find in the world. These albatross go out and forage for their young, and most of what they pick up is plastic. And so these terribly distressing images of albatross chicks and larger birds, the contents of their stomach, which just basically looks like, I suspect, what Rox picks up from the beach. And that wasn't climate change, but the way Chris explained it was, this is climate change, but we can see it because we can see the plastic. Climate change is exactly the same. It's pervasive. It's a global problem. It's going to eat our insides out. And we need to take heed because we're all connected to these processes. And that conference and that talk made me think, wow, firstly, these are my people. There was a group of 400 people in that lecture theatre from various parts of the arts in the US who were clearly passionate about this. And it was coming back to Australia then thinking, okay, we need something that's going to garner that sort of attention and interest and study in Australia. And that's really the beginning of Climate.
Did you get an immediate response from people wanting to engage with it, Guy? Or was it a little bit like, I noticed when you talked about you couldn't watch the Al Gore film, and I think there is a bit of, this is too big to look at. How did people respond when you started being really active in this space?
Well, it's interesting. I came back and I had the grand idea, and then as I tend to, I think, oh, well, it's certainly not something I can do myself. And I'm good at some things, but not at others. And I sort of languished a bit for a while. But I was then approached by two artist activists, Deborah Hart, who famously is one of the climate angels that you will have seen famously in Paris at the time of the conference, and also Fiona Armstrong, who had just set up the Climate and Health Alliance, so a group specifically to health. And they actually cornered me one day in a cafe in Richmond and said, listen, we're thinking that the arts should have an organisation dealing with climate change. And I said, well, gee, so am I. And that was really how it started. But to your question, the clear idea was that the arts is a portal to all sorts of discussions, both the arts in the objects and the things that are produced, but also in the spaces that they inhabit, in the conversations that they allow. And our real prime motivation was to raise awareness in a way which wasn't just numbers and facts and bar graphs and economics and politicians or other people shouting at each other. It was to have that more contemplative space, a place where people could come and feel safe to look at the issues and think about them, maybe talk about them, maybe not. But that was definitely the initial impulse.
Fabulous. And I think we'll come back to what role the arts as both arts experience and as dialogue is over the course of this discussion. But I want to pick up further and to introduce another one of the panelists around that idea of what institutions can do. And Jane alluded to it as well, that, you know, institutions can be spaces to have a dialogue, as you've said, Guy, but also to be demonstrative. And one of our next speakers is going to talk about what's occurred at the Australian Museum. And so it's a pleasure to introduce Zehra Ahmed, who's the Sustainability, Accessibility and Diversity and Inclusion Projects Coordinator at the Australian Museum. Zehra, that takes me right back to my accessible arts days. I had lots of opportunities to introduce people with those job titles. And she led the development, launch and management of the Australian Museum's Sustainability Action Plan. And through her leadership, the Australian Museum is now certified as climate action carbon neutral. She's also a passionate community advocate and has volunteered her years and her time in the Torres Strait Islands in community projects. Zahra's going to take us through a short presentation, because she said it'd be a lot easier to understand what you've done if you can see the presentation. So I'll hand over to you, Zehra.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here tonight and be talking with such an exciting and dynamic group of passionate people. So I'm going to be talking about how we achieved carbon neutrality at the Australian Museum, the importance of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and working for a sustainable 2030. Oh no, my PowerPointness. There we go. So these are the two. Sorry, before I begin, I would just like to say that I work and live on Guringai and on the land of the Guringai and Darug people. This always has and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and any Indigenous people on this call. I also offer my gratitude to the knowledge and stewardship of this land through deep time. It is exactly this care of country, this stewardship by the Indigenous people of a place that we all need to learn from. So these are my two plans that I, myself and my manager, wrote and are responsible for overseeing their development and their implementation. They're both coming to an end, and I'm really pleased to say that they've both been very successful. So talking about sustainability in the Australian Museum, it's very much at the core of what we do. We're preserving this exquisite collection for future generations. The thing that I love most about the museum is only 1% is on display. 99% is out the back, and it's such a joy walking through these stunning collections. So why is it important that we're carbon neutral? The Australian Museum is the first museum in Australia. We're also the first natural history museum to achieve carbon neutrality. This is important because we are a heritage site, and despite those constraints, we've still managed to achieve this, and buildings are some of the biggest emitters of CO2. So it sends this wonderful message to the public that it isn't that hard to achieve carbon neutrality, and that everybody can and should be moving towards it as quickly as possible. So exactly how did we do it? The first thing is you can't manage something that you can't measure. So we did a carbon footprint, and we do year on year, and we use that to inform all of our decisions. And as you can see, I'm sharing this so that you can visually see exactly where all of our emissions come from. So the whole of our organisation, it's around 5,300 tonnes of CO2. And as you can see from the graph, the bulk of our emissions comes from energy use, nearly 70%. And this makes sense that we're a museum and that it comes from air conditioning and lighting our beautiful galleries. So a couple of key projects that we've done over the years that I thought might be interesting was, firstly, we did a chiller upgrade in 2013. So this is all of our air conditioning units. The most exciting part of this, though, is in combination with this, and at the top you can see a butterfly, and then below that is the butterfly, some of the butterfly collection. If you think about the heritage sandstone walls, they're actually really thick and they hold the temperature really well. So at the time, our manager of conservation trialled turning off the air conditioning and letting temperature and humidity drift between certain parameters. So the combination of this upgrade and this kind of innovative forward thinking around collection management meant that we reduced our energy use by 25%, which is pretty fantastic. Now, all of our lights in front of house are LED, and in the last 2 years, we've updated almost all of our back of house lights. I've included entomology because they love their lights, and I love that they love their lights because I counted all of them. And also our new entrance to the museum. So this was built about 4 years ago, and this is carbon neutral in its design, and it's beautiful, firstly. And secondly, I think it starts this great conversation about how do we work with the past and heritage and also look towards the future and innovation. So Crystal Hall is designed as carbon neutral. It doesn't quite function as that, but it's certainly very energy efficient. You can see the solar panels on the roof. As you may or may not know, we've been closed for the last 18 months. So unfortunately, we don't have a new building. We've been expanding our internal space so that we can hold large international exhibitions. So this was about $58 million. I know one of the questions around how can the arts become sustainable, and there's a few different examples that I'll give, but the one that I'd like to use is Green Star. So this Green Star is probably the most robust form of benchmarking for organisations, in particular cultural institutions. Green Star was deferred, and we're picking it up in the next plan, but I did deliver some of the plans for it. And this one was the waste for refurbishment plan. You can see the graph on the right. It gives you an exact breakdown of all of our waste, and we diverted 90. I moved myself, you guys can see, hopefully you can see on the right. 94% of all waste from this construction was recycled. It's pretty fantastic. It's not a bad effort. Okay, now in regards to our front of house, we recycle a huge amount. In addition to the standard waste streams, we also do fluorescent lights, batteries, e-waste, styrofoam, soft plastics. We also have 100% compostable packaging in our cafe on site. So I mentioned becoming carbon neutral, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, there's two parts of the problem. The first is shifting to a low carbon economy as quickly as possible. Sorry, I'm talking about climate change more broadly. And the second part of it is upscaling drawdown solutions as well. We're always going to have to offset a certain amount of our carbon emissions at the museum. And I see this as a great opportunity to talk about the projects that I'm really passionate about and that align with our organisation. So this is First Nations-led land management in the north of Australia. And as you can see, this is cultural burning. This is a low, slow fire done in the cooler months. And if you just remember the horrendous fires that we had in 2019, the summer mega fires, the difference is phenomenal. You can see that animals can, and this is measured by satellites going over every 6 minutes that verify the massive reduction in carbon emissions that this helps mitigate from wildfires. The next project that we're currently working on is purchasing 100% renewable energy. If you remember the carbon footprint I showed you, that's 70% of our emissions gone. And then year on year, we'll continue to reduce. I love this conversation about the arts and how do we drive change. So this is where I think it gets really exciting. So obviously the museum is just one place where we have to talk about our missions and all the problems, but it's about driving greater results more broadly. So you have the federal targets, state targets, and then the City of Sydney targets are actually, I have to admit, very, very exciting. So for 2030, the City of Sydney is aiming to divert 70% of carbon emissions and 90% of all waste from landfill. So we're part of this. It's called the Sustainable Destinations Partnership. And the idea is that we're trying to drive essentially sustainable tourism so that someone can offset their flights, come into Sydney, see an exhibition at the museum, knowing that we're carbon neutral, use public transport, go over to the Opera House, have a dinner that's locally sourced and sustainable, and see a show and stay in the Hilton that's used 100% renewable energy, and so on and so on. You understand the idea. But the main thing that I love about this project is that collectively we work together to address the problems and influence the market and essentially driving the solutions that we want to see. So these are the sustainability pages at the website that talk about what we've done and how we've done it. And I think in regards to cultural institutions, I'm really keen to talk about this because the more cultural institutions that can embed sustainability, then the more likely they are to talk about climate change. And that's really where I see our opportunity as being. So our next 3-year strategy that we're currently developing is a climate change and sustainability action plan. And our corporate strategic plan actually has one whole pillar dedicated to just communicating on climate change and sustainability, which is very exciting. The last year and a half, we have the fabulous Dr. Jenny Newell is head of climate change projects, and she's absolutely remarkable and has done some truly incredible work. So as I mentioned, I think Rox and Jane mentioned some really interesting points about the importance of the opportunity that cultural institutions hold in terms of educating the public. I think the thing that I find most challenging is the fact that the solutions already exist and so few people know about them. In regards to our pages on climate change, we talk very clearly around the causes for climate change, and also the solutions. This is part of our permanent exhibitions. We have a whole section, a small section, but it's still a section that talks very clearly about the causes for climate change and also the solutions. We're about to open a temporary exhibition in Hinsey Hall, which looks at the really exciting, innovative solutions to climate change. So we've secured Australia's first electric motorbike, the first domestic hydrogen battery, flexible print solar, and we've got other information around biotech and seaweed farms. We also have on our website, I think one thing that is interesting and that has changed in the last few years, I don't think you can say anything good came out of the mega fires that we've had and the floods and the droughts, but if anything has come out of it, hopefully it is the fact that people feel that they can talk about their own experience of climate change, whereas in the past people would be much more hesitant and would defer to specialists and scientists unless they'd done, you know, all the reading. So at the museum, we have on our website Capturing Climate Change, and this is where the members of the public can share their own stories around floods and fires and so on, and what they're doing in this space, which is always really exciting to read. I could talk for hours about this topic because I absolutely love it, but obviously I don't want to put everyone to sleep. So I've made it as short as possible, but in regards to the next steps that we're doing, we are mapping all of our work to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I love the SDGs. It's a really clear to-do list for the world for 2030 that we can all work towards. And it's so brilliant to have a plan. We're continuing to do climate outreach with very much the clear objective of engaging people that are climate change skeptics and disengaged on the topic. We're looking to develop a sustainable exhibition standard and try and help drive a standard. We're going to be purchasing renewable energy and looking to switch our fleet to electric. We're also going to be getting a Green Star rating in the next few years and embedding sustainable procurement across all aspects of the museum. And lastly, talking about adaptation, climate change adaptation planning is a huge part of a risk to our organisation. So talking about collections care and conservation and mitigating disaster risk. And then I'd just like to end on a quote by Professor Leslie Hughes, which is, "Every fraction of a degree, every year, and every choice matters." And that's it.
Thank you, Zehra. That was fascinating to see the breadth of work that's being done. You've clearly got amazing institutional buy-in for the project here. Do you think it's easier for an institution that's full of natural scientists to get buy-in on this than it might be for a more traditional arts institution?
I think probably the thing that stops people from communicating about climate change is if they feel as though they're not delivering on sustainability. And that's where I'm, you know, within my little corner of talking about sustainability, I'm so keen to share and try and remove some of the hurdles and barriers with other organisations. I think that is probably one of the biggest hurdles, because if you communicate on climate change and then people go, oh, but look at your waste or look at your, you know, then it's potentially tricky.
Yeah, I think having those clear metrics makes such a big difference to the conversation, because you can also see the benefit of the work you do. And I think our final panelist will probably have something to say about measurables, and that's Professor Mark Howden, and he's the director at the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. His work's focused on how climate impacts on and innovative adaptation options for the systems that we all value: agriculture and food security, natural resource base, ecosystems, biodiversity, energy, water, and urban systems. He's worked on climate variability, change, innovation, and adaptation issues for over 27 years, has authored more than 420 publications, and the national and international greenhouse gas inventories he helped develop are a fundamental part of the Paris Agreement. Now, I've got a line in your bio here, Mark, that says you firmly believe that the arts can motivate and inspire action on climate change. Why do you think the arts are an effective communication tool with regards to climate change? What can artists and the arts community do? Mark? Just checking in there.
Yep, newbie era.
There's one every session, right?
Yeah. That's right. It's past bureau clock. I'll just plead that one. Look, firstly, thanks, Kiersten, for the invitation to be here. And like the other speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on who I met. In my case, it's the Ngunnawal people. and pay my respects to elders past and present. So the question, which is about why is the arts important in terms of engagement and communication and action, and really I think there's a very simple answer in some ways to that, and that is because communicating in terms of facts, figures, diagrams, numbers, that sort of thing, appeals to a small part of the population, but it actually doesn't impact on most of the population. Is that, you know, mostly people tend to act on the basis of narratives. It's on the basis of things they hear from other people. It's the stories that they pass around between each other, even if they don't think of them as stories. It's on ideas which get passed from people to people, things that work and things that didn't. And so as soon as you recognize that as a scientist, then it says if you really want impact, you have to find other pathways. It's not just about communicating the science in a direct way. So how can the science mesh with people from the arts and from many other different areas of activity in a way that works off the strength of both? And so how can we actually inform the practice, and how can the practice inform the science? And so that's really where I think we've done some work, but there's lots and lots more to do. And so my institute engages with people who work on sculpture, people who work on glass, people who work with music, people who work with dance, to try to communicate that. Some years ago, I worked with an artist, David Curtis, an arts teacher who's at Wollongong, actually doing some experiments with students to find out what sort of combinations of arts and science actually makes an impact, not only in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of behaviours. And what we found basically was the combination of those two not only increased the knowledge most, so the numbers stuck, but it actually resulted in the most significant and long-term changes in behaviour. So when you want pro-environmental behaviour, in this case climate change, we were focusing on, it was actually the combination of the two, which was the most successful thing to do. And so we sort of, I think, engage in ways of communicating, innovative ways. So for example, Zehra mentioned a quote there by Leslie Hughes. That quote actually came from me and a colleague of mine, Beck Colvin, and it was picked up by the IPCC 1.5 degrees report because I was a vice chair on that, and that was my attempt to synthesize several hundred pages of science into a 3-line, about 12-word pithy statement, and so that was as concise as I could get that to happen. So that's one way, so that's, what I was after was a Twitterable version of the 1.5 degrees report. Simply so you could actually sort of get the really, really core messages.
Always good to have a strap line, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it worked. It just went everywhere. And but that idea that, every small fraction of temperature matters, because there's a really significant impact from each increment of temperature, that every year matters, that we're running out of time, and that every choice matters by all of us is a really, I think, very powerful set of messages. But one of my colleagues, Andy Reisinger from New Zealand, he actually put that 1.5 degrees report into a haiku. And so he said, okay, well, this is his version of doing an artistic rendition of that report. And so likewise, those are different ways which we try to engage, we try to express, we try to condense, we try to get different parts of people's minds working on this, because it's not just about logic and numbers.
Thank you, Mark. I want to come back to that every little bit counts and ask the panel as a whole around whether the arts can ever actually be zero waste, whether we can ever get to a point where the arts community as a whole is a net good rather than a net contributor. But in the meantime, I'm going to firstly just ask you one more question, Mark, which is really about the most pressing climate issues that you see at the moment. You in the Senate inquiry into the bushfires, you were am I paraphrasing to say somewhat scathing about the Australian response to climate change? Where should we be focusing our attentions?
I think the evidence is increasingly clear that climate change is not a matter for the future, it's a matter for the present. And it's already costing us hugely in the present. And so the real concern is about how that trajectory of costs, and I'm not talking about dollar costs, I'm talking about the whole spectrum of costs, and how that will propagate into the future. So if it's this bad at 1.24 degrees, how bad is it going to be at 2 or at 3? And when we look at, say, things which are fundamental in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, having enough food to eat, having enough water to drink, having roofs over our heads, those are already being stressed by climate change. So agriculture production is down 22% compared with what it would have otherwise been in the absence of climate change. A huge number of people are now increasingly stressed because of water resource lacks, so water, inadequate water and inadequate quality of water because of climate change. And increased cyclone strength and increased distribution of cyclones is already ripping the roofs off people all over the tropics and subtropics of the world. And so, if you think at the most basic needs of humanity, it's already impacting. And the real concern is how that will flow out into the future. So for me, we have a responsibility not only to the future, future generations and non-human occupiers of our world, but also to the current generations, because it's impacting right now. And so at the moment, I just don't think the action matches the challenge that we see ahead.
A pretty strong call to arms, I think there, Mark. Thank you. And I'll come back to tease that out a little bit. I want to go to one of the questions that we've got, which is, it comes back to the materiality question and I guess really around thoughtfulness about what the arts does. It's a great question, so I'm going to read it out straight. And I'm going to give this one to you, Jane, and then to you, Guy. So even though by now there's a high level of awareness about the plight of our planet amongst the general community, and in particular amongst the creative industries, it's been my experience that there is still a significant hierarchy when it comes to materials used by artists and the type of works purchased by collectors. Traditional impactful materials like bronze and paint take precedence over found and reclaimed materials like paper or plastics. The question Miguel's asking, do people agree with this statement? And if so, what needs to occur for this to change? I think Jane, Rox, Guy, you may all have an opinion on this one. So whoever wants to jump in first. All right, I'll throw it to you, Jane. You're in first.
Thanks, Miguel, for your question. And it's
a great question.
Yeah, I think it comes down to positionality. I'm definitely leading in terms of changing curriculum from first year cohort onwards to try and get the students to think about using recycled materials. And definitely in my own practice, there have been transitions. And I think it really depends on which museum and which organisation you're talking about. Some of them have made that transition to more ephemeral work, to thinking about intangible heritage more so than others. But some of the traditional ones, I guess, there is that hierarchy of value. And it's something I sort of try and press against with my being, and a lot of other people do, but I can see from the professional side and from a museum perspective that would still be pervasive. It is tricky, but to me it starts with offering and showing those lenses of sustainability or environmental sensitivity, as I like to put it, as an art educator right from the beginning. That's the only way I can see change happening, and valuing what the students are producing, I guess, in that frame.
Rox, what's been your experience in the way people respond to your objects? Do you feel that there's a hierarchy in the arts world based on material?
Yes and no, although I think there are some leading institutions that have purchased ephemeral work and they might ask the artist to reconstruct it, I can say proudly that a couple of institutions purchased works of mine in the last couple of years, and I'm very happy to remake the work if it deteriorates. So that's the other side of it too, that maybe there's an ongoing relationship with the artist and in the institution if the work necessitates that, or if the materiality of the work necessitates it. But surprisingly, people, I mean, I've been quite happy that people have wanted to live with the work, even though it is essentially rubbish. You know, that's the flip side, that it appears beautiful, but it's got that dark side which speaks about the waste and bigger issues, of course. So that it surprised me, and yeah, I mean, I think institutions need to respond to what artists are making and the reasons why they're making the work. And if they've got issues around conservation or whatever, I mean, there's conservators that are working and that kind of work through those issues as well. Yeah, but I know artists that have worked in a more ephemeral way, that their works are in collections. It might surprise you, but there's names out there. And a lot of the work can be fragile, but it might be remade, or it might be reconsidered, or does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I actually think there's something rather lovely about thinking about working with different medium can mean a different way of engaging, not just with the object, but with the institution over time as well. That's actually something that I think is quite exciting. I wish I was still running Shaw Powerhouse. I'd want to do an exhibition like that. That sounds fabulous, Rox.
Yeah, I mean, Bronwyn Oliver was making really fragile sculptures way back. But, you know, if an institution purchased the work, they may fix it so that it does live longer, you know, or they may ensure that certain conditions around the placement of that work are maintained. So, yeah.
Guy, I want to pick up on that question with you as well, around whether there's a kind of hierarchy of material, but I think let's tease it out a little bit from your experience as well, and we can come into the way the arts industry works, for want of a better word. You know, the whole premise of exhibitions involves heavy shipping of material. You know, you paint your galleries over and over again. There's all of these experiences that make up the broader arts industry. How do you deal with these and try and do them in a way that is sustainable while still managing some of the almost inherent contradictions?
Look, I think you do it in the way that the Australian Museum has clearly done an incredible job of leading by example. And I wish there were more museums and art galleries in Australia who had such a focus on these issues and were thinking about them and coming up with programs and publicly advocating for those programs, because I'm afraid there's a dearth of that, earth in Australia. At the moment. So if we're talking about hierarchy of issues, yeah, the objects, what they're made of is important. Yes, the materials are important. Yes, you know, some fragile materials may require much more conservation and air conditioning over the next 100 years if we want to keep them. So there's some pretty complicated calculations that have to go into that. And I think while it's important to think about what we're making our art out of, and definitely how we're running our museums as businesses, as every business in Australia, we shouldn't be beating ourselves up about these smaller issues about whether I'm going to make a bronze sculpture or an aluminium one or a wooden one or a recycled one. That's not the main game. If we're talking about a hierarchy of issues, it's how are the museums run? How are they governed? Who are on their boards? What are their connections back to other businesses? What's their connections to the fossil fuel industry? Have a look at a work by Gabriele de Vietri, which was exhibited at Monash University Museum of Art in 2019. It's called Maps of Gratitude, Cones of Silence and Lumps of Coal. or more shortly, Fossil Fuel and the Arts 2019. It's the most amazing interactive network map of the filaments and connections within the arts industry in Australia and the fossil fuel industries. And it's frightening. And the question was asked, why do some museums not embrace sustainability publicly or even practically? And one answer was, yes, if you start talking about it, you can have the finger pointed at you because you're not doing the right thing. Well, let me tell you, it's not only not doing the right thing. In some cases, it's having people on your boards of governance who are not only directly connected to the fossil fuel industries, but there are people on there who give generous amounts of money to the very organisations who are denying the existence of climate change and have been advocating for decades against the actions that we need to take. And these people come into the openings at these galleries and museums, and they swan around and they drink the champagne and they meet the artists, and they can go back and tell all their friends what wonderful patrons of the arts they are. And meanwhile, they're doing all this other stuff, not even behind our backs. It's out there in public. You can read about it. There was a great article in I think the Monthly 2 or 3 months ago, pointing out these connections, some of these connections. And so I think what we need to do is, sure, we need to get our own houses in order in terms of, as artists, how we make things, as exhibitors, what paint we use, how much we recycle. Really important, because the museums are almost sacred spaces. And there's been research to show that museums are one of the most trusted public spaces and voices in the world, in any particular country. You walk into a museum, you believe what they're telling you. You walk into an art museum, you don't think they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. You go there to receive wisdom or aesthetic sensibility or whatever, but you don't think you're being hoodwinked. So when a museum comes out and makes the statement, as Zehra said, part of our aim is to raise awareness about climate change and then to actually implement the practical response to that. That is an incredibly powerful message to every person who walks into that museum and hears about that museum, because they think, well, if they're doing it, if it's good enough for them, well, it should be good enough for me. Now, why aren't any of the major national or state galleries putting out similar messages? Is it just because they don't have scientists running the gallery? Or is it perhaps because some of the people who are involved with those institutions, they would be scared to take those sorts of actions, because then they're going to be worried about the blowback in terms of funding or other connections. So this is the real problem. It has been a problem as long as money's been involved in the world, but it's a real problem now. And I suspect Mark can back me up here. The barriers to action on climate change aren't the solutions. We know what the solutions are. It's all laid out. The barriers are money, vested interests, the fossil fuel industry, and the lobbying and influence that they have at every level, not only of government, but of corporatocracy. So perhaps the most important thing we can do in the arts is to say that, and to ask our institutions, who's on your board? What connections do they have? What right does an institution who is seeking to hold up the highest values of our civilization and preserve them into the future, or say they want to preserve them into the future, what right do they have to have people engaged at their core who are, when they walk out the door, trying to destroy not only our civilization, but the planet that our civilization evolved from? There's a hierarchy.
It's almost quite an extraordinary call to arms, Guy. I'm picturing an arts ecosystem where all of those elements have been weeded out of it. You would be looking at a completely different arts environment, basically, which I think is the point you're making, is that it's so bred into the way we fund and support the arts community at the moment.
I mean, if I can just put this point, how many arts institutions have as a major sponsor a tobacco company these days? No.
None. Okay, can be done.
Here's my case.
Zehra, I don't want to put you on the spot because I know what it's like when you're speaking on behalf of an organisation, but have issues like sponsorship or board engagement, do they come up in discussions around your sustainability objectives?
We're actually really fortunate at the museum, and granted, this is quite unique. So our CEO and director is Kim McKay, and she was actually the co-founder of Clean Up Australia Day, which then went on to be Clean Up the World. So the fact that we have someone at the very top of our organisation who is deeply passionate and committed to this topic is truly extraordinary. I think everything that Guy pointed out is absolutely correct and spot on, and I mean, I agree with Guy completely. We are quite fortunate at the museum. Like, for example, on the trust, one of our members' husbands is part of a really exciting offsetting project in Queensland, which is, that's quite unusual that we have that on our trust, and that we have people talking with great enthusiasm about, drawdown solutions and increasing soil fertility and things like that. But no, I completely agree with Guy. Do you mind, Chris, if I address the question about zero waste?
No, please go for it. Yep, that's an open question. It's an open question to the panel.
So not to sound naive, but I do believe that if we set truly ambitious targets, innovation does come out, and that you do see solutions coming out. So I would absolutely say 100% we could move to zero waste. But it needs to have that clear kind of aim and objective, and a kind of call to arms, as some of the things that Guy mentioned. If I could just elaborate a little bit on that. So for example, at the museum, there's definitely a push for new media. You can't really put on a show now without there being a lot of new media content, and it's almost expected these days. Vincent, there was an exhibition of Vincent van Gogh in Sydney just recently, and it was all projections. So I don't think, I completely agree about this idea of, how we ship and transport our objects, how we package them. All of this has to be addressed, absolutely. But I think the first part is also putting some really aspirational targets. So I did hear of a theatre company where they set energy reduction targets. And they were like, no, we can't do this. We're a theatre company. We light stages. But you know what? You set a target, people come up with innovative ways. Like, they did a lot of spotlighting and they did experimental lighting. And I think it's absolutely possible. The other thing that I wanted to add just about the role of cultural institutions, everything that Guy and everyone else has mentioned is true, that cultural institutions are a trusted authority, and I can't think of any better way to educate and inform. So the example I'm going to use is, I studied politics and international relations, but truly I would say my education came from when I was a kid, and it was going around galleries. So Sebastião Salgado did these incredible photographs, and I was 7 when I saw this exhibition. And it's a gold pit mine, and you literally see hundreds of people scaling the walls. Everyone's nodding, they've seen this work. It's truly amazing. And I walk, obviously I didn't have a concept of, human rights and the procurement supply chain and the need for transparency and the Modern Slavery Act. You don't need to. You just need to see Sebastião Salgado's work. You'll never be able to purchase things without having a clear, because that work really brilliantly talked about this divide between product and labour. And that's essentially how we can consume so carelessly, is because we don't see at what cost or who made these objects that we have that are so dispensable, and so, there's so many of them. And that was it. I was 7 and I already had a sense of the supply chain and procurement and the Modern Slavery Act. So I absolutely think that, art has an incredible role. And I'm sorry, tonight was supposed to be our First Nations director, Laura McBride, talking, and she was actually going to talk about some of the beautiful artworks in our First Nations galleries, and they speak really beautifully to this point as well. I'm a poor substitute, but anyway.
I think you're fantastic substitute, Zehra. I'm just loving that there's been so many examples over this where people really do have that light bulb moment. It's like, right, I get it now. It's not just talk, but I get it. And actually that probably is the best example of the fact that the arts can do this, right? That even artists and arts workers and administrators have that moment themselves. I think that's really significant. I'm going to come back into another question we've got that keeps teasing out the economics around the arts and creative industries. This is one, I think I'll ask you this one first, Mark, and I'll read it again out as it's written. So Kate Raworth in her book Donut Economics is proposing an alternative model to the current dependency on the GDP as a measure of a country's productivity, where the environment, in fact, plays a vital role in assessing sustainable resource allocation. So should a similar model as that proposed by Raworth be implemented by the creative industries? I think we probably got some sense about both Guy and Zehra's answer there. Mark, what's your feelings about that?
Thanks, Kiersten. Just before I answer that, I just wanted to go back to Zehra's point, which merges with the point answer, I guess. And that is, she was just pointing out that if you actually set targets, which are realistic targets, you don't want things which are completely ridiculous, but if they're realistic targets and you do that in a way that engages people and empowers them, then you do get that fantastic innovation. And for me, the example that you used of spotlights and lighting in a stage is that when you actually think about it, if you use incandescent type lights or quartz halogen lights, they not only generate a huge amount of heat, which actually makes the actors feel really uncomfortable, that heat has to be removed by air conditioning, which adds to your greenhouse gas burden. And so if you shift, say, to LEDs, you not only make people more comfortable, you reduce your air conditioning, you reduce the amount of energy you draw down in the first place, but they actually last longer and they're much more flexible because you can change the color composition of these things. And so you know, when you start innovating, you often find there's massive amounts of co-benefit. It's not just solving the problem that you wanted to solve, but it solves a whole stack of other things and gives you lots of extras. And so for me, innovation is a really important thing, because if you do it right, you can get so many extra things out of it. And because it feeds hope, because people can see change, which is positive change, and they can see how it's done, and it doesn't have to be led from the top, it can be led from the bottom. And so for me, that's a really important thing. Now, in terms of responding to the Kate Raworth question, absolutely. So there's a long history of thinking about what we call genuine progress indicators or similar things. And they're to, instead of sort of lumping the goods and the bads together, which is what measures like GDP do, it separates the goods and the bads out. And so you subtract the bads from the goods, and so that gives you a better indication. And you can do that in all sorts of ways. You can do that with a social component or an ecological component, climate component, whatever you want. And to me, that makes so much sense, that we're actually having a much more accountable, a much more clear, a much more comprehensive view of what we gain and what we give. And so that's I think an important part. But one of the things that it sort of tends to miss out is it sort of tends to miss out on the regenerative elements that I think do come from the arts. And so it's not, again, it comes, moves beyond the nuts and bolts type stuff, but into those senses of revitalizing society, of all of the non-monetary type stuff, giving people a sense of place, safe spaces to consult and discuss with things, catalysts for change, able to raise difficult questions, the point that Guy was making before, in a way which doesn't cost people jobs and cause problems and stress. And so for me, the sort of approach that the arts can do is almost like genuine progress indicator plus, like it's actually adding a lot more to that concept than the concept itself.
Thank you, Mark. I think that idea of the additional and the catalytic is a really interesting one, because we're not good at measuring that, but there are many arts projects that bring that together. And I'm going to ask Jane about a project that she's been working on, which is around the benefits and critical issues for artists within manufacturing communities, a very different environment to the arts one that we normally see in Australia. And I'm going to ask, can you tell us about your manufacturing creativity project in Vietnam, and where you see that might fit into this type of context?
Thank you. Yes, I think I guess the frames of reference I use for that project are thinking about opening up new opportunities for artists so they can get access to skills and materials and often clean waste in a factory community, but also they have opportunities for new audiences. So it's an incredibly, most artists that walk into a manufacturing community, and I take a very pragmatic approach as an artist, it's like a studio environment. We share that real desire for innovation and creativity. And so it's a very, once you acclimatize to the social sort of aspects of it. So there are these, what I call getting in and getting on strategies that I write about, of how to actually work effectively with those communities. And a lot of that is about taking on their culture, like turning up at the same time, for example, or eating lunch together, simple things like that. But yeah, I think that the reason why I think this is an opportunity for artists is that people are less and less making work for galleries and more thinking about doing artist residencies. So they're turning from making objects to thinking about experience. They're no longer thinking about making a specific artwork as thinking about their creative practice, because if you're thinking about being a creative practitioner, you notice I use that word more than artist because it's actually gives me more opportunities. I can be a designer one day, I can be a curator the next day. So I always also think about all industry as creative industry. So I never use that term, I just use it. I think we're all in it together. And I think what I normally do is try and find a company and match them with an artist, or find a company that I can match with, and then spend some time scoping that environment, having a look around at what clean waste there is, finding an opportunity for a studio space, which is often a corner, connecting with the scientists and the R&D team. It's a very energized, amazingly low cost way to operate as an artist. And I've done it in Germany and in Belgium, USA, and Vietnam. So it's fairly robust model. The reason why my approach is a bit different to a lot of others is that often people use intermediaries, but as artists, we're natural born risk takers. We're really good at telling stories and developing narratives, and we can access those environments on a very socially equitable level. So we sort of relate to everybody there. It's not an elite situation. It's very, very special work. It's really difficult sometimes, but it's really, really great.
Oh, I want to see some of this work. Kind of reminding me of some of the ethos of the old community cultural development stuff that, you know, seems to have gone out of fashion now, but it's just reshaped in a new way, right, Jane? Like, yeah,
I think well, I draw on approaches like communism. So it's thinking about how we're really recasting our creative practice, I think. And we're thinking about new social frameworks, new ethical frameworks. Art and ethics is a big part of what I do now. And yeah, it's a very comfortable sort of place to be because there's so many opportunities, but also very stimulating. So it's great. I love it. Yeah.
Guy, you've obviously thought deeply about that ethical dimension of arts practice and arts engagement. How do you work with industry and with different communities in climate art and in the work that you do?
Well, I should say, firstly, I've recently retired from the Board of Climate Art, and they've wheeled me out because they still think I can talk. They know I won't shut up. So
yeah, you're doing well, mate. You're good. Yeah.
Look, well, from an ethical point of view, we have always been very careful about who we will engage with, both in terms of sponsorship and in terms of actual collaboration. And we always do our due diligence on that. And I think that's very important for any organisation now, individual, but you know, for organisations definitely, because what you do and who you do it with and what they are like will come out some way. We now know that, you know, there's no not many secrets left in the world that don't get ventilated via digital media. So from a reputational point of view, it's really important, but it's also really important to be authentic to your values. And if you're an organisation which is standing up for, in our case, sustainability, climate change action, etc., we would look pretty stupid if we took money from, an organisation that didn't have similarly aligned values. And I think that will become more and more the case in relation to all arts organisations. Did I answer the question?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm interested in how you tease some of those issues out as you go about your work. Where have you seen where you've been able to advocate really strongly in that sense about making ethical decisions and engagement? What are some of the wins?
Some of the wins would probably have to mean one would have to disclose some of the choices, and that would mean talking about the ones that didn't win.
You rejected.
Probably,
yeah, right.
Probably another good idea. But for example, people love aligning themselves with banks because banks are big and powerful and have a lot of brand recognition and have a lot of money. Let's face it. When we looked at aligning ourselves with some sort of financial institution, there was one that particularly stood out because it was on a credit union model. It's called Bank Australia now, but they have specific social and environmental and clearly stated objectives, measurable, which align perfectly with what we were doing. And so when you're working with people like that, it's an absolute pleasure because you're on the same wavelength in terms of the outcomes you're ultimately trying to achieve, the way that you go about those processes, and there's no sort of subterfuge going on about, who's doing what behind one's back. And that's a really, I think perhaps that maybe sort of links in a way to what Jane was talking about. It's working in that for a common cause. That's the way we should all be working.
I'm going to ask Zehra this question as well, Guy, but we've talked a bit about measurability. To my knowledge, and please tell me if I'm wrong, there's no set targets across the whole of the arts, and there's, so as a consequence, you're measuring as an individual artist or as an institution. Is there a need for some type of collective decision around what the targets will be?
If you're talking about practical outcomes, sorry. No. If you're talking about practical outcomes, I think it's absolutely important because, as Zehra said, you can't change what you can't measure, and I think Mark also pointed to that's a really important part of it. But there are parts, and Mark alluded to this, which are very difficult to measure. How do you measure the impact on a young 7-year-old Zehra who sees Sebastian Salgado? Well, we can see the impact now. And I should say, Zehra, I don't know if you're aware, but I was fortunate enough to be in Paris at the time of the climate conference. And in the subways of Paris, there was an exhibition of Sebastian Salgado at about 20 different stations in these amazing ornate frames, so that you got off the subway everywhere and there was another amazing, enormous image. How do you measure the impact of that? How do you measure the impact of sorry, his name's someone, you know who I'm talking about, but his amazing work, Ice Watch.
Eliasson.
Thank you, Eliasson. Outside the Pantheon in Paris, these enormous monoliths of melting ice, which he brought down from Greenland, and were just dripping away as the climate conference sort of moved on. So there are measurables, but the arts have a lot of immeasurables. And it's not only in that raising the awareness and getting people to think about these things, there's a therapeutic part of the arts. There's, where do I go where do we all go over the last year when we couldn't go anywhere else? We went to the arts, whether it was watching a film, whether it was reading a book or listening to music. Where do I find solace for the grief that I have over the climate? It's reading some beautifully written book by Richard Flanagan or whoever else who's tapped into the feelings that I can't articulate, but reveals it within me and gives me a sense of, I'm in this with other people. So those things are really hard to measure, but they're really important. So yes, for the practical things like how much waste do we save, how much, all of those things, they need to be measured. That the science is supremely important, but the arts provides that other part, which is also very important for us in terms of our whole being of understanding who we are, understanding how the planet works, not only as a mechanism, but as something much more numinous.
Zehra, how do you go after that?
No, I have a couple of suggestions. So in regards to changing hearts and minds, so this isn't my particular project, so I can't speak to it with great authority, but Dr. Jenny Newell at the Australian Museum is actually doing work around measuring the engagement with the public and their understanding of climate change. And it's really fascinating because they map, the engaged, so there's the alarmed, the engaged, and it goes right through to the skeptics and so on. And it is, at the museum, it actually is about really measuring changing minds, which is exciting. I think I agree, it is very hard to measure it with the arts, but certainly everyone here and everyone listening knows the value. That's in terms of changing hearts and minds. In regards to your second point around benchmarking, I think benchmarking is incredibly important. So I look to the Opera House. So the Opera House has been, they're on their 4th or 5th plan. I've only just completed one, and I juggle a few different strategies. So technically I only really do a day and a half on sustainability. And a lot of organisations don't have someone in that role. And that's why it is so important that we work together. I think both of my projects are so important. Everybody should be sharing and should be working collectively. These are such important topics. We can't afford to not be. I think talking about benchmarking is critical in terms of driving outcomes and knowing where we want to go. And I absolutely have suggestions around that in regards to art exhibitions and set design and cultural institutions. It would be around your exhibition construction, around creating, like, there should be an international standard that's really exciting, that looks at the whole life cycle process of putting on an art exhibition. And that can then inform artists and the choices that artists make and their ability to go, you know what, I'm never going to touch MDF, and I will, actively tell everyone not to use MDF, and I'm going to make sure I'm using sustainable wood sort. There's a whole, it can absolutely be mapped out. It can absolutely be done. But it does take, I think, a collective effort and driving a standard. And I think if we all work collectively, we're going to get there a lot faster.
Mark, has there ever been any discussion much faster? Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was just going to add one last thing. So working at the Australian Museum, a lot of people tend to forget this. The bulk of the staff are scientists. So the bulk of our staff are studying ecology and bearing witness to biodiversity loss. And we have extinction cabinets. Like, it's heartbreaking. I'm so glad that I don't work in that area because I'm far too soft. So my perspective, talking about driving sustainability and driving change in our practices, that's easy. That's not hard. Bearing witness to climate change is hard. And essentially what I do with both my strategies is behavioural change. It's about how do you take something that sits on someone's periphery and bring it into their centre focus of something that they have to do from the very beginning of the process right through to the very end.
Thank you, Zehra. Mark, picking up on what both Zehra and Guy has said, noting all the intangibles, are you aware, have there ever been discussions about some collective standardisation for the arts, be that theatre, galleries, museums? I know from being at Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, while it's a contested space, nonetheless, there are discussions about what you do in water or what you do in environment or what you do in biodiversity with the aspiration of having an agreed target. I don't think I've ever heard about this in the arts. I'm wondering whether it's something that's come up in your work at the Climate Change Institute.
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's an interesting point, and I guess the point that Zehra was moving towards, and also Rox and Jane, is that increasingly as we use waste products, effectively we're going into the circular economy and integrating the arts within the circular economy, and hopefully that will become less and less of an issue. But even where you have in a sense, high energy installations, such as a bronze, there's no reason why you can't recycle bronze and use renewable energy in the heating and casting of it. And so to some extent, I think we have to nuance the discussion away from the material itself into the embodied greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with that installation or that particular artwork. And because even if you think about digital, so if you've got a digital artwork, that actually still has a greenhouse gas footprint.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to get away entirely from the greenhouse gas footprint. But what I think we can do is try to have a conversation where the value proposition of what we're doing is actually greater than the cost of that residual footprint that we occupy.
I think this comes down to as well, there's decisions that institutions make, there's decisions that individual artists make. Rox, I'm going to throw to you. And I'm asking you to speak, of course, for every artist, but knowing what your work is like, do artists have to take responsibility for this themselves? Should this be at the driving point of decision making that artists make, how sustainable they are, what they can do in terms of sustainability?
I think it's changing, actually. And I was recently in an exhibition by Elizabeth, curated by Liz Kelly, who's a glass artist. Jane, I don't know if you know Liz, but she spoke about how she rethought her practice and she is committed to reducing her carbon footprint. And so she's modified her practice to reflect her concern with the environment. And I think a lot of artists, and they always have, used what's at hand, what's been discarded or reconfigured things around them. And certainly the people that I'm hanging out with, my tribe, a lot of them are reviewing what they're making and also remaking work. I mean, I remake my work for different contexts. I can make something that's hanging down, or I can curl it up and it's a small sculpture for a prize I want to submit to. Do you know what I mean? But I think there's more talking about this, and certainly more concerns about what's really happening in our world. And whilst we're all talking about the art sector, we know that this is huge. This is huge, and it's cross-sector that we need to take a stand on and do best practice. And thank goodness for the Australian Museum taking the lead on this. And hopefully others will follow, and museums and the art sector, we have to lead by example and walk the walk and talk the talk. So artists, I think, that are committed to environmental concerns and, climate action might be doing it in their practice, as well as being out in the streets and protesting or sending letters to their local councils and state MPs, et cetera, in whatever ways they can to try and change what's happening now, because if we don't, we're stuffed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jane, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, while I've been listening to this, I've been reflecting back to my time at COFA, which, to be fair, was quite some time ago now, but I can't remember a single discussion about sustainability. I can remember an enormous amount of screen printing ink going down the drain, but I can't remember a single conversation about this. Is it changing?
I think that I want to answer Miguel's great question. He's put some really thoughtful questions tonight. Thanks, Miguel, for keeping us on.
That's going to be my last question, Jane. So,
right. Well, I think that
you can read it out, and we'll.
Okay, so Miguel's.
That's collaborative. Yeah.
Many creatives want to reduce their environmental impact, but don't have the tools to know where to start. What is one resource platform tool that you'd recommend to a creative as a starting point to develop a more sustainable practice? And I usually start with looking at biomimicry, I think I mentioned, but there's an amazing woman called Janine Bainus, and she did a TED talk, as well as there is biomimicry.org. And if you can get hold of her video and share that with your team, it completely organizes your brain in terms of how to think about working with materials, because there's the systems level, which some of you might be involved with, And then there's the nano level, which the scientists might be involved with. But as artists, we're interested in that meso level. So we're looking at, materials that we can handle. And if we think about just how nature's been so smart at making large scale objects, but with less material and energy. And there's another book that I'll give you, I'll put it up later on, a book called Lightness, which also unpacks this idea of using less material and energy. And I think they're the two things that really can make a huge impact on how we make our work. And it's just, I call it a lens. So as you're developing any creative response, if you just drop that lens, and it may not work for every work, but more and more often, if you introduce those principles, people can't really turn back from that. It really does change your practice forever. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're into the last few minutes, and I just think that's an excellent question, don't you think, to round out the session? So I'm going to put that to everyone at the panel about a resource or platform or tool that you'd recommend, either to, let's tease it out a bit more, either to a creative practitioner or to an institution. If you're an arts administrator, what's a good starting point? I'm also going to ask if people have got any great ideas, that anyone listening, if they pop them in the chat as well. I've noticed we picked up a few really good things in the chat. So something that you'd recommend to help people grow and learn in this area. Mark, what would you recommend in terms of resources or tools?
Yeah, thanks, Kiersten. Because I'm actually not an arts practitioner, I don't have a good answer to that one from that perspective. But I think a good start from a more sort of, I guess, in a sciencey type perspective, is just getting one of the online greenhouse gas emission calculators and actually just looking at your own footprint. And so this is, you as a person, or you as a family, or you as a member of the community, and just saying, okay, well, what is my footprint, and where can I shave that down? And so, there was that whole Craig Rucastle, set of episodes on the ABC, which is a really great way of taking more complex ideas and crunching them down to behaviours and how we can change those behaviours. So that's separate from the practice of art, but it's actually us as humans and what our footprint is as a human. And I think that's a very complementary approach.
I think that's a really useful resource. Apart from anything else, it makes you stop eating a lot of meat very, very quickly when you realise what you are doing through those type of decisions. If you've got a particular one you'd recommend, Mark, if you could pop it in the chat, that would probably be really useful. Rox, as an artist, what are some of the tools or resources or indeed artists that you think people should be looking at in this space?
I just want to say thank you, Mark. I like the idea of auditing yourself, and I think artists need to audit themselves. Luke Eileen did an audit of the MCA 10 years ago. So that's an example of someone embedded in that institution. Also, Lucas, Eileen and Kim Williams were the group that were called Plastic Free Biennale in Brooke Andrews Biennale last year. And they did some interesting work there. It didn't get too far because of the lack of resources, but they were certainly trying to audit the footprint of waste at Cockatoo Island and beyond. So that was an interesting project. For artists, NAVA is a terrific advocacy group, and in 2019 they did something. They did a report on artists responding to the climate crisis, and they kind of captured artists on the ground in different locations. And what that shows is that artists are banding together and becoming, little collectives concerned. I hope NAVA kind of collectivises that and runs with the concerns we have as a whole. And I think we need to support them as visual practitioners as much as we can, because they're our direct link to government, And yeah, there are a couple of things now.
They're fabulous, and good call out for Nava there. I'm going to go and have a look at that report when we get off this. Guy, a couple of resources or tools that you recommend.
Look, from the practical point of view, I'm not aware of anything in Australia that specifically addresses artists. But you know, most artists' practices are, if you take away the creative part of it, are like any other business or manufacturing enterprise on a small scale. And most state governments, there's many organisations which have guides to greening your business. And if you look at them, you'll get a lot of practical tips. From an organisational point of view, once again, I'm not aware of anything in Australia. I think maybe Museums Australia put something out, and I know that their conference coming up in June in Canberra will address some of these issues. So they may have some resources or are developing them. I know overseas, for example, in the UK, an organisation called Julie's Bicycle.
Oh,
Julie's,
yeah.
Julie_IE_S bicycle
That's a great one.
is one of the pioneers in this field, and they have done incredible things in the UK and Europe, developing processes, accreditation for museums and cultural organisations. There may be some resources there for individual artists as well, but they're definitely worth looking at. I think the European Union has a similar organisation relating to museums. I can't think what its name is, but I'm sure a Google search would find it. And I also know there are a number of green museum organisations. If you go onto Twitter, you'll find them. And some are probably quite small, but some appear to be quite large and well resourced in the United States. So if you start searching, you'll find things. But for those practical, you know, how do I run my studio? What sort of light globe should I use, et cetera, any general business guide to sustainability will be of assistance.
Great. Zehra, we're out of time. So just one last resource or tip you want to leave us with.
I have so many. Okay. No.
Put them in the chat. Put them in the chat and we'll get SAMAG to circulate them. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, the City of Sydney went carbon neutral before it did all of its energy reduction. I'm just giving this as an example. The reason why is they said it's so urgent. We have to go carbon neutral as quickly as possible. So actually, that's what I would encourage. There we go. That's my one takeaway. Just stick with that.
Thank you. We are at the end of the time. That was such a good discussion. We could just keep going, honestly. But I do want to thank all our panelists, Rox, Jane, Guy, Zehra and Mark. It was a real pleasure to be able to be part of this session with you. I'm going to go off and calculate my carbon footprint, which will no doubt be a little bit terrifying, but Zehra, maybe I'll come back to you and we can talk further about that. Thank you everyone so much for your time. Thank you, SAMAG for bringing together such a diverse range of people and giving us an opportunity to discuss this really critical topic. I've seen lots of great resources landing in the chat, and I'm sure there'll be more that will be put out by SAMAG over time. So thank you, everyone. It's been a great pleasure to be here with you tonight.
Thanks, Kiersten.
Thank you.
Thank you.